his wife. There's a scene with Perkins and his wife having their baby. Everybody's given pills. Oh, it's really heavy duty. It's a fascinating movie. Waltzing Matilda, you know, the way things come out. And that's it. And then all those flash scenes around Sydney. And it's fascinating.
I would have sat next to it.
Hey, how are you?
Good evening, Oberlin students, faculty, staff, alumni, and members of the wider community. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Timothy Hall. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the college, and I'm also the faculty advisor to the Oberlin College Republicans and Libertarians, the sponsor of tonight's event. Tonight's lecture is another installment in the Ronald Reagan Political Lectureship Series, a series sponsored by the club for many years. The club and the college would like to offer special thanks to trustee Stephen Shapiro, Oberlin College alumnus of 1983, for his ongoing support for the Reagan series. I would like to take this opportunity, too, to announce another installment of the Reagan series this coming Tuesday at 7:30. Another Oberlin alum, William Flax, of the class of 1956, will be discussing the topic of liberty in greater detail Tuesday night at 7:30 in West Lecture. So it should be a great event to continue discussing the themes introduced in tonight's event. So it falls to me as well to offer a couple of bureaucratic remarks about the format of tonight's event, among which no flash photography during the event proper, please. You can take my picture as much as you'd like, but if you have a flash camera, you should get it out of your system now. So let me introduce tonight's speaker, college senior Nick Miller.
Good evening, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. My name is Nick Miller, and I'm the president of the Oberlin College Republicans and Libertarians. I would like to thank, on behalf of our members and myself, Mr. Stephen Shapiro for his continuing support and for making all of this possible. I would also like to thank new donors to the Ronald Reagan Political Lectureship Series. Thank you all. Former Congressman Ron Paul of Texas enjoys a national reputation as the premier advocate for liberty in politics today. Dr. Paul is the leading spokesman for limited constitutional government, low taxes, free markets, and a return to sound monetary policies based on commodity-backed currency. He is known among both his colleagues in Congress and his constituents for his consistent voting record in the House of Representatives. Dr. Paul never voted for legislation unless the proposed measure is expressly authorized by the Constitution. In the words of former Treasury Secretary William Simon, Dr. Paul is the one exception to the gang of 535 on Capitol Hill. Born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Dr. Paul graduated from Gettysburg College and the Duke University School of Medicine before proudly serving as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force during the 1960s. He and his wife, Carol, moved to Texas in 1968, where he began his medical practice in Brazoria County. As a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology, Dr. Paul has delivered more than 4,000 babies. Dr. Paul is the author of several books, including Liberty Defined, The Revolution, a Manifesto, and End the Fed. He has been a distinguished scholar for the Ludwig von Mises Institute and is widely quoted by scholars and writers in the fields of monetary policy, banking, and political economy. He has received many awards and honors during his career in Congress from the organizations such as the National Taxpayers Union, Citizens Against Government Waste, the Council for Competitive Economy, and countless others. Dr. Paul's consistent voting record prompted one congressman to comment that there are few people in public life who through thick and thin, rain and shine, stick to their principles. And Ron Paul is one of those few. Since his retirement from Congress, Dr. Paul has continued to work for limited constitutional government through organizations he founded, including the Foundation for Rational Economics and Education, Campaign for Liberty, and Liberty PAC. Beginning last month, he hosts the nationally syndicated Ron Paul's America, a series of daily radio commentaries and a weekly podcast. Dr. Paul and his wife, Carol, currently reside in Lake Jackson, Texas, and are the proud parents of 5 children and have 19 grandchildren. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Ron Paul.
Love is the opposite of war, and I love peace, so thank you. Nicholas, thank you for the introduction, and President Krislov, I'm delighted to have met you, and all the young people, and all the young at heart who love liberty, thank you for inviting me. I was asked to talk about liberty as if that would be a strange subject for myself, but it's a subject that I like to talk about. And I have a definition for liberty. It means tolerance. And how do I define tolerance? Any campus that will allow me to come and speak with you and visit with you, I say that's the tolerance I like. Thanks for having me. But it is great to come to college campuses. I did a lot of that in the campaign, and I continue to do this. Now, I've been asked rather recently, by your president, what am I doing these days? And I told him, I'm a lobbyist. And he looked at me, Washington? No, I live in Texas and I travel around. I lobby for liberty by going to the campuses of America who are interested in liberty. That's really where the action is. I talk a lot about a revolution. A lot of our literature talks about revolution. And it's a revolution of ideas. And I think it's time for a revolution of ideas. I think that our country is rather stale. It's stale, and we're in serious economic trouble. We're careless with our civil liberties, and we're bankrupting ourselves because we're in way too many countries. We spend too much money fighting wars we don't need to fight. It's time to bring our troops home. But also know that if you cannot inspire young people in the college campuses, the movement or the revolution is not alive and well. Probably too many people here are too young, but it wasn't that many years ago when there was a revolutionary spirit, which is ongoing in China right now. In 1989, Tiananmen Square occurred. And to me, it was an amazing event. And I can remember that picture so clearly, that one young Chinese man that stood by himself barehanded with a little satchel and just would not move away from a tank. No matter which way that tank moved, he moved. as if that was man against the state, if ever there was a picture of that. And there's been improvements, and that wasn't that many years after we were killing each other. When you think about it, the Korean War, which is ongoing, and partially because of our foolish foreign policy, that this continues to go. But there are changes. Somebody had the good sense to actually talk to people, and talking to the Chinese has been a blessing. Just think that this whole idea is, over the years I've been criticized for saying, well, why don't we just talk to them before we start bombing them? And think about the magnificent time, a scary time, but the magnificent event that Kennedy had at least the willingness to talk to Khrushchev over the missile crisis in Cuba. That, I think, is a wonderful thing. And those were scary times. So we live in times today where we need a real revolutionary spirit. Amen. But we have been careless as a country. We've been very wealthy. We have been the wealthiest country and the freest country with the largest middle class ever and the best distribution of wealth, which no longer exists. That has gone by the wayside. And all you have to do is look at the last 5 years. And it's gotten much worse. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, the middle class is shrinking, the rich get bailed out, the poor lose their jobs, they lose their mortgages, and they lose their houses due to policies that were all designed to be gracious and helpful and make sure there was a safety net for everybody, and we end up with this mess that we have. So it's not a lack of good intention, but I do believe that we're in serious problem because of the ideas we follow. That is why I come to the campuses. You've got to change the idea of another generation to let them understand economic policies, the principles of liberty, and come around to a sensible foreign policy. That's what we need today. I start with the notion that liberty comes as an individual matter. I believe liberty is individual. It's not collective. Once you see people in groups, that is when abuse comes. And for so many years, we abused groups because they belonged to a group. There was slavery and discrimination and all these problems the law mandated. And I think the solution is seeing that everybody is an individual. Everybody is an important individual. And every single person has to be treated equally under the rule of law, and we would solve a lot of our problems if we would respect that. So our liberties come to us, our life and our liberties come to us in a natural way. I happen to believe it comes in a God-given way from a creator. Others say it's a natural thing. But it doesn't come from a government. If you ever assume the government gives us something, they can take it away from us. So if you want government and you want it to be limited, it should be limited to the protection of that liberty, not to be a manipulator and an intervener, tell you how to run your life and what your habits should be. It shouldn't regulate the economy. It shouldn't tell other people around the world what to do. That is what has a problem with it. If you recognize all of us as individuals, this means that people act in their self-interest, which is nothing wrong with that. Just think if everybody acted in their self-interest and took care of themselves, there'd be not very many problems around the world. But there's always the risk. People say, oh no, there's risk, with too much liberty. And I had a member of Congress once when they were voting for some bill that was intervening in the personal lives of the people. And I said, why are you voting for this? He said, well, the people are too dumb to take care of themselves. Well, I reject that. Yeah, there are some that are going to mess up. But what happens if you send some of those dumb people to Washington and they mess up and they mess it up for all of us? Yes, there is this risk. If you have your liberty, your social liberty and your economic liberty, you may mess up. You may mess up your life personally. You may mess up your life economically. And you can't go crawling. If you have your liberty, you just can't go crawling and demanding, well, I messed up. My neighbor has to take care of me now. But you know, in the true sense of the word, in a society that protects liberty, means that you can't ask the government to do anything you can't do. If you can't go to your neighbor to get yourself a bailout, then you can't send me, the congressman, to go to your neighbor to get you a bailout either. You have to suffer the consequences. So there is risk, and there will be inequalities. But a society that is designed only for equality, one thing you can say is they can achieve it, but it's usually an equality of poverty, and that is what I see coming today. We're having more equality than ever, and it's an equality of poverty. At the same time, we see the super rich getting much richer. So we have to understand this whole issue of the individual who assumes responsibility for himself, that he gets to keep the fruits of his labor. He has to accept the responsibility and the consequence of his personal action, but he should accept the consequence of his economic action. Which means that if you have the incentive to take care of yourself, and you do well, and you have a natural right to your life, and that extension to your right to your life and your liberty, you should have the right to the fruits of your labor. It belongs to you. And therefore, under that circumstance, under those circumstances, if you work hard and take care of yourself and your family, the tax code would be quite different. Believe me, it would be quite different. The tax code is only meant to be manipulated and benefit one group against another group, and there's always so much pretense goes on all this goodness. Just like I alluded to the housing bubble. That was all designed, easy money, easy credits, low interest rates, a Community Reinvestment Act, buy a house for $100,000. Prices will go up, inflation will feed it, and then you can borrow more money against it. And then the banks are told they have to make bad loans. The people do not qualify. And then those who orchestrate that never once noticed that there was a bubble. Never once were they aware of it. If they were certainly very quiet on it, because if they'd have learned anything, they wouldn't be now doing the same thing that they did that created the housing bubble crisis and the economic bubble, because here we had an economic crisis. We had too much spending, too much borrowing, too much taxes, too much regulation, too much inflation, too low of interest rates, so the bubble bursts like we should have expected. So they say, we better do something, we better do something. So they increase the spending, increase the borrowing, increase the taxes, increasing the printing presses. They let the printing presses run wild, and they expected to solve the problem. There's no way that's going to work. And that is why we don't have our recovery. Into 5 years already, and even the statistics that they give you now about how well the economy is going, it's fiction. And this is one of the most important things that you should do if you're interested in this subject, is sort the truth out from fiction. And quite frankly, that's a difficult job, because I've asked this at other universities, and I might just try it here. If you have political leaders come, those in office, Republicans or Democrats, and they make pronouncements, whether they're economic pronouncements or pronouncements of why we have to send more kids off to die, how many of you believe what they tell you? Let me see how many hands go up. You say, oh yeah, we trust our government. No, you don't. That's healthy. That is very healthy, because we can't correct it if we don't realize where the truth is. And it doesn't come from the politicians who demagogue the issues. Most people say what we need in Washington is more compromise. We need these two parties to get together, because all they're doing is fighting with each other. But that's not the way I see it. I see that we've had way too much compromise. We have too much collusion between the two elements. They come together. They might want to spend the money differently, but they don't care about deficits. They want the money to be printed, but they don't understand the Fed. They want the Fed. They're not against the welfare system. So when the country is seeming to get richer and richer when the bubble is being formed, it's easy, but it's a fiction. There's no real wealth there. If you pay all the bills today, we're flat out broke. The only thing that holds us together today is a trust in the U.S. dollar. And there was a time the U.S. dollar was as good as gold. And the very first thing when we moved toward more authoritarianism in the 30s was immediately to take your right away to own a piece of gold. We now have accepted this notion that the government can solve all these problems. And government has grown exponentially. And just have to remember, if the government gets involved in dealing with trying to improve your social and personal life, or if they want to be involved in how you should spend your money and invest your money and take care of yourself economically, they can only do that at the expense of personal liberty. Because there's an extraction. They interfere with your rights on what you can do. And just look at what's happening today. Are civil liberties protected today? No, they're not protected. Scare the people. Scare the people for war. You know, going into Iraq. We were going in there to get the Al-Qaeda and stop all these weapons of mass destruction. All a bunch of lies. And yet we did it. But the financial situation has been the same thing. Scare the people. And of course, after 9/11, it was a golden opportunity for those who likes authoritarianism. Because within days, a couple weeks, the Patriot Act was passed over my strong objection, because that is a vicious act. So we do have to understand what's going on. We need to seek out the truth, and then we have to decide whether we have faith and confidence in ourselves and in a free society. America was never a perfect country, but we got around to a point about 100 years ago that we called ourselves an exceptional nation. Well, I'd like to think of ourselves as being exceptional in a way that we had not a perfect, but a pretty darn good constitution. We had a lot of prosperity, and we had some good values, which I think have been undermined. But today, we have a whole philosophy that says our American exceptionalism means that we have this moral obligation to police the world. That we have to do it because we're good, they're bad, and they have this funny religion over there, and they look different than us, and we're going over there, even if it costs us $5 trillion, we're going to impose our ways on them, we're going to force them to have elections, and what happens when they finally have an election? They elect the wrong people, and we have to reject the people they elect. So we do have these very, very many problems, whether it's this attack on civil liberties or whether it's the foreign policy, the economic problems that we have. Now, the biggest job to figure out the truth is figure out the good intentions. I've already talked about good intentions. Give everybody a house. That sounds like a good idea. I happen to think the best way to make sure the maximum number of people have a house and have a job is to protect civil liberties and economic liberties alike and make the government minimal and make sure people can't rob, steal, or hurt anybody or abuse anybody, and then you will have the maximum benefit of all the people. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. We had a taste of it, and now we have sharply drifted away. But there are some up there that like to impose their will and make sure that you know how to spend your money. But others want to tell you about your personal lifestyle. And they want to have all the rules and the regulations about what you should do and you should not do. For instance, for some reason, our country's been pretty good on First Amendments. You know, the First Amendment, and people can practice their own religion, and they can pick their religion or no religion, and that's fine. We have pretty good, even in our country, with the various universities, we have intellectual freedom. But why is it that for 100 years now, we as a people have accepted the notion that those bureaucrats and the politicians know exactly what you should or should not put into your mouth or into your body? I think if you have the right to think about your eternity and your intellectual life, you ought to have the right to determine what you put into your body, whether it hurts you or not. That is your decision, and we don't need the war on drugs. reason for this. For the conservatives, I would say it costs too much money and it doesn't work. That's a pretty good reason. It's trillions of dollars since the Nixon years when they started this modern war on drugs. And it doesn't work because people still use drugs. But the whole thing is that part of drugs that is very regulated by the government, that's worse than anything in the illegal system. When you look at the prescription drug program, you have a lot more addictions with prescription drugs than you do with the so-called illegal drugs. And just look at what's going on now. We go over and fight these ridiculous wars. We don't know what the goals are. We do it without a declaration. We never know when the wars are over. We send these men and women over there constantly, and they get a little confused, and they see blood and guts and death, and then they come back and they're torn to pieces, so they go to a government doctor. And guess what? The drug industry has so much influence, they get put on drugs, psychotropic drugs, that compounds the problem. And now, last year, we had veterans committing suicide to a greater number than people getting killed in combat. And we're going to continue to have this problem. So I would say you, the people, have better sense than anything that the government can do, because this has gone too far. They say, yeah, I got to take care of you. I got to protect you against yourself, which governments can't do. Once they start on that, it's nothing but trouble. So yeah, they don't want you to have heroin, so that's illegal. Don't use heroin. But it carries over to the point now where they won't even allow you to drink raw milk.
Right. Yeah.
I think you should be able to drink raw milk if you want. Some people say, well, that could be dangerous, and all those same arguments. But really the point is, it's dangers in the world, there's always problems, and who do you want to monitor those dangers? Do you think the bureaucrats and the politicians are smart enough? I will not take it away from them, because most of the people I met in Washington come across as decent people, they're honest people, they want to do what's right, and they're well-intended. But you know about good intentions, and you know where that takes you sometimes. And I think good intentions are irrelevant. And I think the only thing that is relevant is whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And that is intellectual, and that is why this is an intellectual fight. It's a university fight. It is something that right now has spread to the internet. And back in the time of the Tiananmen Square, all they had were a few fax machines, and it was seen worldwide by the fax machines. But today, we have an energized youth movement and a tool which is outside the main establishment called the internet. And believe me, there is no way they're going to stop this revolution in the advancement in the cause of liberty. Victor Hugo said that if an army invades a country, they can be fought and they can be stopped. But if an idea invades a country, you can't stop it. Yeah. So obviously, to you already know that I don't like militancy. I don't want to use force. I don't want to throw our weight around. I don't want to be a bully. But in another way, I am very proud of the fact that you can have an influence on what you're doing by persuasion and by trying to educate people. That's why the university is so important. If the true revolution toward a freer society and a freer country doesn't exist on the campus, it's not going to exist. And you know, I often say, and this might be, it might be a mixed bag here because you're known for such gracious and wonderful music, but I think if you end up with a true revolution, you're going to have young people involved, they're going to be energetic, and there's going to be music with it. Economically, we've been slipping and sliding, and you hear the arguments, and everybody knows the Republicans are the fiscal conservatives and Democrats are the big spenders. Well, I don't buy into that at all. We did have some Republicans in charge a few years back, but they have exceptions. They say, oh yeah, we're fiscal conservatives except when we have to go overseas. pass out your money and get involved in war, then they're not fiscal conservatives, they're big spenders. But right now, there's a big argument going on about the 10-year budget. You know, we used to frown in the 50s and 60s. We'd always hear the 5-year plan. The Soviets and the Chinese had 5-year plans. And it would be laughed at. How can a government have 5-year plans? Well, we have 10-year plans now. We're not doing the communists and the socialists. We have a 10-year plan on the budget. So the Democrats come up and say, well, the budget's at $3.5 trillion. And there's baseline budgeting, which Republicans and Democrats support. That means there's automatic increase. So the automatic increase in 10 years is going to take us up to $6 trillion. And if you nibble the slightest bit on anything on there, you're cruel and you're evil, you don't care about people, you lack humanitarian instincts and all of this. So what is the argument? Republicans want to increase the budget by $2.4 trillion, and the Democrats, the big spenders, they want to increase it by $2.5 trillion. And then they're going to argue about this, and then they have these campaigns. They have 2 candidates. Oh, they're diametrically opposed, you know. And one saying this and one saying that. Oh, yeah, if you vote for this guy, it'll be the end of the world. If you vote for this guy, no, that'll destroy everything. And yet, when have we seen a real change in policy in the last 100 years? Really? So what we're talking about is real change. Real change, but it's not new and different. I didn't invent it. A couple economists didn't invent it. It's taken many, many years, if not hundreds, thousands of years, since the Magna Carta, talking about individual liberty. But in our last 100 years, we've been going in the wrong direction. But I think what happened 100 years ago is the founders understood the concept of liberty, and it was a unified thing. But 100 years ago, we had this pretense of the two-party system, and one said, oh, I'm going to defend economic liberty, you know, for the rich. And somebody else says, I'm going to defend personal liberty, and then they fight back and forth and pretend that they're two different things. But they're not. If you start with the concept of individual liberty, the importance of the person, if you have a right to your life and the fruits of your labor, you have to be able to defend personal liberty, your social liberties, but you have to defend economic liberties. You can't divide these up or the whole thing falls apart, and that is what has happened. That's why we have to put this concept back together again. A lot of people get worried because it sounds like an overwhelming task. You know, it's been going on a long time, the debt is bad, and how are you ever going to get 51% of the people to agree with these strange ideas? This is extremism I'm talking about. Not so. The people in Washington are the extremists. They're the ones who think that budgets don't matter, debt doesn't matter, trillions of dollars for wars that you can't win doesn't matter, that if you need money, you just print the money, and they call us the extremists. You know, protect liberty and balance the budget and have honest money. So I would say we have to turn that concept around to the point where we understand what we're talking about. But I may be overconfident, but I really do maintain a lot of confidence that a free society really will thrive. We'll all thrive. There will be more prosperity. There will be less fighting and less wars because, for instance, of sound money. If you have sound money, you can't print money. Every war is fought by inflation. That is, governments just print the money. This, right now, more so than ever. There's probably $6 trillion and more to come yet from the wars of the last 12 years. So this is going to continue. So if you want to restrain, some might restrain, well, we have runaway welfare. Well, we're at, 38 million people getting food stamps, 42, 47 plus right now. When will it ever stop? You know when it's going to stop? Is when the dollar stops. There's no way you can have these trillions and trillions of dollars of deficit and printing the money. You say, well, yeah, we heard people say that back in the 70s when we went off the gold standard. And if you look at the last 30 years, the standard of living hasn't been doing well. If you look at real income of 1971 with the severance of gold to the dollar, real incomes are lower now than they were back then. If you look at the past 10 years, definitely down. If you look at the last 5 years, everybody's aware of the problems now. And they said there's no inflation. I have no idea what the cost of your education is, and I'm not going to get into that part. But I do know that nationally, the cost of education is going up. And I think last year it was 8% or so, and the government tells us that there's no inflation. There's a private free market economist who measures inflation, and he measures the CPI, which was invented by the government. He says it's 9%. Well, how could that be? The government says it's just less than 2%, so don't worry about it. There's no inflation. Talk to somebody who's on Social Security and find out if their cost of living is going up. Their cost of living is going up, their standard of living is going down, and that is what's happening. And so it isn't a theoretical argument. This is a real-life argument about what kind of government we have, what economic policies we have, what kind of foreign policy we have. And fortunately for me, the conclusion being that the more liberty, the better off we'll be, is pretty well defended by the Constitution. But what good is the Constitution if they ignore it? And there's just a few people up there that reinterpret it, misinterpret it, and they go about their ways. When the debate came up for going to war in Iraq, I was on foreign affairs. And it was to give the president, at the time Bush, the authority to go to war if he felt like it. It wasn't a declaration of war, it says, oh, the president knows what's best for us. So they give this grant of authority, and so I did a bit of complaining. I said, that's not the way I understand it should be. If you want to take the country to war, you're supposed to declare the war and make sure the people know about it, make sure we all get behind it, and make sure we win it and get it over with. And boy, they didn't like it. They took a voice vote, and nobody, including myself, didn't want to have a declaration of war. So I made them vote on it and have a recorded vote, and still nobody voted to go to war. But the chairman of the committee at that time sort of looked at me and sort of did a bit of ridicule by saying, oh yeah, Ron Paul, we know you're constitutional, all that. He says, but I want you to know, Congressman Paul, that that part of the Constitution, dealing with the war issue, is anachronistic. We don't follow it anymore. Wow. But that is not just an isolated statement. That's generally what is thought in Washington. So we don't have rule of law. If you think about how courts sometimes rule and how we go to war, how do we go to war? It's sometimes we don't declare war, but sometimes we go to NATO. Sometimes we go to the United Nations. Oh, I got my authority from the United Nations. Well, when did that happen? If we as a people want to subject ourselves and deliver our sovereignty to a United Nations, and who knows what the vote will be like, then you should change the Constitution. Otherwise, if we allow them to just ignore the Constitution willy-nilly, there's nothing left. And I'm afraid we're getting close to that. But, except for the revolution, that's not going to be allowed to happen. And where are we going to get to 51%? I don't even think about the 51%. I think about you, because you're not part of the 59%. You're in a unique category. You're in a special school. You're studying. You're interested enough to come to a lecture like this. So, there's this smaller group that's so important that delivers prevailing attitudes and ideas. People in the media, people on TV, but it's bigger now. It's people on the internet, people in schools, the teachers and the writers and the movies. And the attitude has come out basically for the last 60, 70 years has been an authoritarian approach. Do this, do that. You can't do this, you can't smoke, you can't drink, this business. Economically, we have to regulate the economy. Just think if we treated the economy like we treat a newspaper. Think about prior restraint. Who here would say, well, it's a good idea. They said something in the paper the other day and I didn't like it, and the politicians are always getting ripped off, so we should have prior restraint. We should have the government review everything. Nobody would consider that ever. Nobody would consider restraints on the product that we have and socially in our religion. But as soon as it comes for anything economic, what people do, there's always prior restraint. It's, you can't do this, you can't do that. Cities, towns, states, everybody else comes in and say, well, we have to regulate you because you might do something wrong. Well, that is true. But somebody might do something wrong with their personal liberty. Somebody might do something wrong in their economic liberty. But I don't understand why we can't think at least about not subjecting every economic transaction to prior restraint. And, you know, if we had magicians in Washington, geniuses that really knew what was best, what is the best form of energy? Some people ask me that, what's the best form of energy? I said, why would you ask the politician that? I mean, what do the politicians know? The best form of energy can be decided by the people. And I say, oh, then there'll be no environmental protection. Wrong. The market and property rights protects the environment just as well, or better than the government. The government creates an EPA, and they write regulations to benefit the big companies. And then they propose, cap and trade. Okay, we'll cap this, but you can trade your right to pollute. And it's those kind of approaches. In a free society, you can't pollute. And you can't pollute the water or the air or anything else. And therefore, if you're in the energy business, if you're going to ruin the environment, you should be closed down rather quickly if you're messing up. But this idea that politicians make these decisions, you know, it's scary. You might be able to accept it, but you come to Washington to look around and see if they have the intelligence to figure out, what about medical care? What makes you think that bureaucrats in Washington know how to deliver medical care? One of the most personal things conceivable. Everything now is going to flow through Washington. They check up on the patients using too many drugs, check up on the doctors prescribing too many drugs, and doing all this. And then they say, well, don't they have this patient's bill of rights for privacy? And who gets to visit relatives in the hospital? We're really working on this. No way. All that bill does on privacy is make sure that everything goes through the government, and currently that's getting much worse. The government deserves no information from you on your personal medical records if you believe in a free society. But back to the whole issue of how do you get to the 52%? No, you just need a minority of people. Samuel Adams talked about this when he said that it doesn't take a majority, it takes a minority, an irate, tireless minority who actually believes in something and will start brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. And that will bring about change. And changes won't come to Washington because of a politician. The politicians are more or less puppets. They reflect a culture and a society and an understanding. We reflect in Washington Keynesian economics. But there's something happening today that is different than it has been in my lifetime up until 5 years ago. The announcement of the end of Keynesian economics came 5 years ago. The most magnificent political event in my lifetime was the disintegration of the Soviet Empire overnight. I was drafted in 1962 during the Cuban crisis, and I was in for a total of 5 years in the 60s, active duty and on reserve duty. And under those circumstances, you know, we have to be able to understand that if we don't change the ideas, then nothing can happen. And that is what's happening right now. There's a tremendous difference of what's going on. Things are different, and attitudes are different, and they are changing. But they're in between right now. They're in flux. But that Soviet system that I had to stand up against, so to speak, in the 60s, and there was such fear and intimidation. They had 30,000 nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles and missiles in Cuba. It was, you know, a scary situation compared to today. But just think, we lived that down with the, you know, with the conversation, and Kennedy and Khrushchev talked, and guess what? An agreement came, yeah. Khrushchev took out the missiles out of Cuba, Kennedy took the missiles out of Turkey. Sounds like a pretty good arrangement for me. Tone down the rhetoric. So this is what we need more of. But the majority of the people will come around if the leadership it has a prevailing attitude. And there's no reason why it can't be that of liberty. Personal property rights, contract rights, Equal justice in the courts, no discrimination by groups, no negative nor positive. Everybody is an individual because they're an individual, and they gain nothing, nor should they lose anything because they belong to a group. We are individuals, and we should be protected as individuals and have individual liberty protected equally. James Lowell wrote a poem, once to every man and nation comes that moment that we must decide. I sort of think that that's appropriate for now, that we have to decide, we as individuals. You'll have to decide whether everything I said is sort of, extremism and, we can't contemplate too much liberty. Or you might decide, sounds like an interesting message. So individually we make decisions. But I think that not only do we in our lives, at various times in our lives, make these key decisions, I think for our nation, and matter of fact for Western civilization, because it's under a challenge. Just as the Soviet system collapsed, I believe we're in the middle of this. It's just accelerating. We're being held together with an illusion that the dollar can bail out everybody and anybody, and it's not true. And the scary part is, if you look at monetary history, you can debase the currency over a long period of time, but the conclusion is rapid, the loss of confidence. And there's no reason to be confident in our dollar system. But if you say, no, the Fed's a pretty good outfit, they took pretty good care of us, they give us prosperity, and if we get a recession, they get us out of it. Not believable anymore, not in the past years, they're on the defensive, because they haven't been able to do that. And now, whether it's the dollar-denominated system, the Keynesian economic model, just as the Soviet model failed, this one is failing too. And this might make some people a little bit nervous because, that has a large ramification. But we've lost 98% of the value of the dollar since the Fed took over. But it hasn't been, there were times when it was more noticeable, like in the 70s. I mean, we had interest rates of 21% and price inflation the government admitted to of 15%. Now there's a lot of confusion about what is happening. But I am personally convinced that this system cannot continue, and when it ends, it will end in a big event, which would be similar to a little event in Cyprus, when people finally throw in the towel. And the reason why it will be so chaotic is not only have we devised a system where whatever the people seem to want and whatever the politicians seem to think what they have to spend is to get reelected, it can borrow endlessly from the Fed. So the Fed creates this high-powered money. If you need $10 billion or $100 billion, and they were doing it in hundreds of billions for the bailout, so they shift that over and the Fed creates out of thin air with the click of a computer. But that is only the beginning. That is minor. That's only the start when you think about fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking can take that and multiply it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times, depending on the velocity of money. Right now, that's a little bit slower. But when people get frightened because of fractional reserve banking, if we all of us here had one bank and all our money in there, and tomorrow morning you decide, oh, let's all go to the bank, I want my cash, this is scary stuff, like they did in Cyprus. Guess what? They don't have the money. This is not there. They don't have cash. No, they can't do that. So you have to come back Monday. And then what if the lines got longer and longer and longer? They'll say, well, we have to have a bank holiday. But the reason we don't go is that what I'm saying is not accepted as conventional wisdom. That's just scaremongering, and they want you to believe something else. And so far, so good. But if you look at history, you just can't create new money out of thin air endlessly to the tune of trillions of dollars and think that nothing will happen. If this were true, that we could continue to do this, this means that we as Americans are in the catbird seat. We're in good shape because they're going to print the money, and the Chinese and others will sell us anything that we want. We can buy oil. We won't have to drill for oil. We're going to buy all our oil from Saudi Arabia, and we could just live off printing press money. Nobody believes that. But in a way, that's sort of what we believe partially. But it also means it won't work. And so that time is going to come. And when that comes, we just don't know that. Well, I argue the case for liberty. I come to the campuses because I think it's so important. I see tremendous encouragement around the country and around the world. I believe freedom is the great answer, not because there are those conservative Republicans who preach one thing and do something else. I think it's because the freedom issue brings people together. I am sure in a crowd like this that your social habits are different. I know your religious habits will be different. You can have religious habits here or no habits, and we tolerate it and we enjoy that freedom. But if you understand the principles of freedom and principles of liberty, we should all be together. We should all defend liberty, even if we use it differently. Economically, it would be different. We should come together with that issue. But for me personally, the reason I want the government out of my life, essentially, except for the protection of the liberty, is that I think the goal in a person's life should be to be as productive and seek excellence and virtue the best you can, taking care of your family and all these more important things than just being a politician. So if you want to seek excellence and virtue, don't depend on the government. Believe me, everything they do, I mean, that's what they want to do. They want excellence and fairness and everything else, but it's always at the expense of liberty. We have become too complacent. We're a very, very wealthy country, and for decades, 100 years or longer, many years longer. And it was because we were a free society. We had sound money, we had contracts and property rights. And we concentrated on the materialism, the redistribution of the material wealth that we had, and it was to be done in Washington. What did that create? The lobbying system. The lobbying system was created for the redistribution of wealth, and who was lobbying for liberty? Not very many people. So now the wealth, it naturally goes to a rich class when you debase the currency, but it goes to the privileged class when you do the bailouts and everything else. So this is the predicament that we're in now, and also the reason that if we seek a society that is more productive, more creative, if we want our rights to our life in our social ways and economic ways, we have to opt for individual liberty. That is why I come. That is why I visit many campuses. That is why I am not a lobbyist in Washington, because when the minds of a whole group of people or a whole generation changes, government will reflect our views. So I come here with as far as I'm concerned, a cheerful message, because things are changing for the better. Things are going to change. There's a failed system out there, and the system hasn't worked, and it's been based on authoritarianism, command society. I argue the case, and I vote for a free society. Thank you very much. We'll be taking some questions, but while we're getting ready, I do want to introduce my wife, somebody I've been married to for 56 years, my wife Carol. I always get worried because a lot of times she gets more applause than I get, so I got to be careful.
Am I up first?
Yeah, go ahead. I think so.
All right. Thanks. So I like a lot of things you said about the state. I'm not really a huge fan of state control of a lot of things, but I have wondered, seeing how environmentalism has developed, what it has meant to have some states with less regulation than others on the environment. I know you don't like the EPA a lot, but I wonder if we allow the states to have total control over their environmental regulation, won't that create a perverse incentive to allow people to pollute in my state because then we can bring more jobs and that sort of thing.
No, he's concerned about if you didn't have the federal government involved, the states might not all do it equally, and it would be far from perfect, and that's probably the case. But I argue for a lot less government. I don't think the agency of government, where it's preempting everything, is the way to do it. But it should be through property rights. I think it would be stricter. I was raised in Pittsburgh, and that was a filthy city and it was all cleaned up before the EPA came in, but it was local regulations. The rivers got cleaned up, and there were local ordinances that were based on property rights. You don't have a right to pollute. But I still think the federal government's going to have some involvement. I think there are international borders. At times you're going to have to talk about it, and it should be done through negotiations, the best thing possible. Even today, which is when you deal with China, that's from our viewpoint, it's sort of like a lawless society. But they're starting to get the message on the environment, and they know that there's going to be problems. So eventually, they have to be educated to know it's in their own self-interest that they better do something. But rivers are another example. I think your concern might be that, if you're on the southern end of a river going into a new state and your state doesn't get any of the pollution, no, you don't have a right to do that. There should be recourse in the courts. But pollution came about during the Industrial Revolution when big business and big government, got together. And they were never convicted of anything or restrained in any way. And today, our government is still a big polluter. The Pentagon's a big polluter. You ever heard about the burn pits in Iraq? And people got sick from this. They just burn everything. Oh, it's a foreign country. We'll just burn it. I mean, total disrespect. So our government is I think there could be some, government in a limited fashion. But to say that all we need are 40,000 EPA inspectors to come and check everything you do, what that does, it ends up making the cost of a production, very, very costly, and probably doesn't change things too much. And then there's too much money under the table on how regulations are passed.
Congressman Barney Frank, going back to what you were talking about with people putting things in their body, 100 years of the government regulating that and everything. What do you think of Senator Rand Paul's efforts right now in Kentucky to pass the Hemp Farming Act in Kentucky and his efforts in Congress? And did you ever think it was going to take this long to get that passed?
Well, he's asking about Rand's bill. I haven't read it, but I'm not going to object to it. I think it must be a good bill. No, I have worked on this issue for a long time. As a typical example, I often use the hemp issue as sort of like the raw milk issue. People don't want to have heroin legalized, but it leads to you can't drink raw milk. I don't know if anybody remembers in a debate this subject came up, and it was in the Bible Belt, and I said, I understand, Ron Paul, you'd legalize drugs and you'd legalize heroin. How horrible. You don't care about the kids. And I said to the big audience out there, I said, okay, if heroin were legalized tomorrow, how many of you would use it? No, nobody would. So why do they need the government to do that? The same thing with hemp. This hemp thing, I was told once, and you're probably an expert on hemp, but this is a good story. This is at least a story I heard, and it makes my point. They said if you want to get high on hemp, you need a joint as big as a phone pole. But anyway, that's just, if you're arguing for freedom, it doesn't matter that much. But the whole thing, it's a farm product. So they send the hemp to Canada, and we buy products from Canada made out of hemp. I mean, it just shows how ridiculous it is. It's such a shame that the founders would think this is a disgrace, to think that we're having an argument at the federal level whether or not we're going to allow the people to grow hemp. I think the founders grew a lot of hemp. We were growing hemp up until World War II. It was a good product. So this is how this do-goodiness, this do-good stuff just gets totally out of control. And that's why I like to draw a much sharper line. Get the government out of our lives and out of our economy.
Hi, Mr. Paul. In 2008, you ran under the Libertarian ticket for president.
No, not 2008.
Oh, really?
I'll correct you when I'm ready.
I'm sorry. Well, I feel as though your political opinions, your political positions, do not really fit into our current two-party system, neither on the Republican side nor the Democratic side. And I was wondering what your views are on the two-party system, and if you don't agree with it, what are your suggestions or ideas for fixing it?
Well, I would like to suggest that we would benefit from a two-party system. Right now, we only have one party. That's the problem here. It was in 1988 I ran as a libertarian. I think that if you want, I think everybody, you should do what they want. If you want to be a Green Party person or a Libertarian or a Constitutional Party people, just do it. And so far there are no laws against it, except there's a lot of prohibitions. You can't get on ballots. You can't get into debates. It's very unfair. So it depends on, I guess in '88 I was more patient. I got less patient, so I ran as a Republican. Of course, I was always elected to Congress as a Republican. And, but I think the parties are in many ways irrelevant. And I deal in the issue of ideas. Like Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now. I want to have people, we all believe in liberty now, and I want these ideas to permeate the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. If it doesn't, they're not worth anything. I mean, just the Republican Party is not likely to bring about the issues I'm talking about. They should be able to help. But I'll give you a good example of how that worked, because I've talked a whole lot about the Federal Reserve and how much abuse we get from that. And I said we should have audit of the Federal Reserve. And we worked on that for years and years, and we passed it twice in the House to the majority, but with a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans, because it was not a divisive issue and came together. So the Republicans and Democrats both finally accepted the idea that central banking shouldn't be done in secret, and they shouldn't be printing this money and bailing out the rich. So that's what must happen. But in the meantime, the process, if a lot of people ask me that question, should I run as a libertarian, as an independent, and all that? Yeah, do whatever you want. but it's handicapped right now. Because quite frankly, if I had not been involved in the Republican primary, sadly, I probably wouldn't have been able to come visit with you tonight. And that's just a reality. So but too many people have been talked into this loyalty to party. And it's both sides. Here I'm telling you the parties are alike. But there's this vicious fight over power and who's going to control things. And they fight over this. I think that it's the ideas that count, and the politicians are a reflection of that. So change your minds, and Washington will change. Government reflects the people.
Hi there. I was wondering if you can share your views on anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism.
Okay, he asked about anarcho-capitalism. The person that's probably written the most about is Murray Rothbard. And anarcho means anarchist. And they essentially would have no government. All government would be private. I haven't gotten to that point yet. I would think that maybe that is an ultimate goal, but not for a long time to come. We have a bigger job just stopping the slide into tyranny, let alone saying that we can accept the notion that no government should exist. So I don't accept that. But I certainly accept the minimalist approach to government with the sole purpose of protecting liberty, property, and contract. Today, the government interferes with our property, interferes with our contract, and they're the counterfeiters. So we should hold them accountable. But I am not an anarcho-capitalist.
Dr. Paul, you speak about a revolution in values, and I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on the prevalence of consumerist culture and consumer values over environmental and social concerns, and how you see individual freedom and individual self-interest in the long term aligning with broader social and environmental values.
Yeah, I think this is an important question, because I don't usually use the word democracy. I want to emphasize republic. Woo! democracy and the sanctity of the majority is a very dangerous thing, as de Tocqueville pointed out. And why should you give the dictatorship to the majority? That destroys the rights of the minority. But when it comes to consumerism and consumers, in the free market, and Mises, the great Austrian economist, said that the consumer is king. The consumer, I mean, in a really true free market, he decides everything. Decides which business exists. He really indirectly decides what labor prices will be if the labor cost goes up and they're not competitive. It's really a tough ball game. But if every single penny a consumer spends is a vote, I'm voting for this product. Steve Jobs, people voted for him, and he became rich. We should distinguish the richness of a Steve Jobs for producing a product that we all subsidize versus those who have become billionaires because they make money in the military-industrial complex or know how to manipulate the banking system. That should be a big difference. So wealth is to be criticized, and I'm always doing that, but not if they take care of the consumer. The consumer is the one place where really grassroots democracy works.
Thank you for coming to speak to us, Dr. Paul. I have a question. I was reading about your experience both as an OBGYN as well as your We the People Act, which, in my understanding, would prohibit federal courts from reviewing cases under the right to privacy. Is that correct?
Well, I'm afraid that I didn't get all those words there.
Oh, I'm sorry. My question ultimately is this. Does any government, federal, state, or local, have a right to limit access to contraception, in your opinion? Contraception? Yes.
She asked about, does anybody have a right to contraception? And I say no. You have a right to your life. You have a right to take care of your body. But you don't have a right to make your neighbor pay for a birth control pill. I wouldn't understand that. But you have a right to use contraception. That's your body. You have a right to use it. And you can't have a law that says thou shalt not be able to use it. You get to make the choice. So you have that right. But you don't have a right to force somebody else to subsidize you. So I think that would solve a lot of problems. Don't use any force on people to get what you want.
Dr. Paul, I'm 100% with you on the oppressive power of government. My grandfather was Hungarian and spent a few years in Stalin's gulags. But where you're losing me is when you divide freedom and equality. And what I'm asking is, if you're going to extend liberty, and you're going to fight for liberty in the political sphere, do you not think that it is just as important to fight for liberty in the economic sphere and having people have, control over their workplaces and not just liberty for their bosses, but liberty for the workers themselves?
Well, I think the free market does exactly that. You have the right to get a job. You have a right to quit when you don't want something. You have a right to demand that you be safe. You have a right to join a union. But you don't have a right to coerce. So, most businesses, without government coercion, has a tremendous self-interest into taking care of their workers. There's that's how they exist. We were talking about the consumers. You want the most productive workers, and if you have a productive free market society, believe me, the pay will go up. And I think that, if you protect everybody's rights, and especially, a lot of people think that if you don't think unions should have special power, that means you're against unions. No, workers have a right to get together and say, hey, look, we want, more safety and these other things. But once again, it's back to this preemption, assuming that, let's say, your argument is that 1% of the companies of the world, of the country, might be abusive. What are you going to do? Have 40,000 bureaucrats chasing after the other 99% that never did any abuse at all? And if they do violate another person's rights and they injure people, they should be liable. But believe me, they have every reason in the world to be protective of their workers. But when it comes to other things, you might want to make the case for, a minimum wage. Well, it's unfair. Well, no, I'm against interference in contract. So why don't you have a law to make sure there's no poor people? Let's have a minimum wage like in New York, it's 15. Why are they pikers? Make the minimum wage $35 an hour and make everybody happy. So once you get involved in that, they say, oh no, that's too much. Well, interference is too much, so I think the market can sort this out as long as you respect everybody's personal liberty.
Two more questions from the audience, and I want to remind everyone that Tuesday at 7:30, the club is hosting another event with Liberty Discussed Further in the West Lecture Hall. So let's have two more questions from the audience for Representative Paul.
Hi, Dr. Paul. During your speech, you seem to treat liberty as a commodity which can be improved universally, that you are a protector of all liberty and that all liberty can be increased at the same time. My concept of liberty is that when you give one person liberty, it's inherent that you take away liberty from someone else. And that there is no way to increase everyone's liberty at the same time, because there's always people that disagree. So how do you navigate situations where one person's liberty infringes on another person's?
Okay, he suggests that if I give you liberty, you have to, in order for you to get it, you have to take it away from somebody else. That sort of reminds me of the economic argument that one person's gain is another person's loss. You know, in economics, they say, but it isn't true in economics. When you have two voluntary groups come together and one person has an item and you have $100, and you'd rather have that item than your $100, both sides are satisfied. There's not one at the expense of others. So your liberty to do what you want, I can't even conceive of anything that would hurt somebody else's liberty. You can't force them to do it, and you're doing everything voluntarily. You don't hurt anybody, and there's no aggression. I don't think you hurt anybody else's liberty under those circumstances.
Hi there, Dr. Paul. I'm short for this microphone. Thank you very much for coming and contributing to and your interest in diversity of opinion on this campus. I've quite enjoyed your speech. What it did leave me wondering, however, was what your opinion is on what the role of government should be rather than what it shouldn't be. And more specifically, I'd be interested in knowing what you think the government's responsibilities are in terms of consumer protection.
She asked about consumer protection and how would I define what the government should do. And I think they're the same. Protect liberty. The government, I said I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, which means you devise voluntary, which, by the way, there are some voluntary groups who settle disputes. You know, you can go to a private arbitration panel, you can agree to do that. So there are private arbitration panels to solve these disputes. But I think you do need that you do need that much government. So if somebody comes into my house and illegally, and I don't want to shoot him, but I can subdue him, you know, I have to have somebody to call, you know. So I think having government there, a policeman that can settle this, I think that's very important, but it's very limited. Now, the other one was on consumerism. Well, like I said about the consumer is the most powerful person in the free market. The free market does not protect workers and labor unions or business people or profits. It protects themselves. The consumer is the beneficiary. So they're the ones who benefit the most from a free market economy because quality goes up and prices go down. So I think it's the best consumer protection agency ever. You know, there was one time, and you probably know the name, John Stossel was a consumer protectionist for a long time where he was aggressively passing for more regulation till he finally found out it wasn't working so well and that the consumer is best protected by the free market, and if the consumer is unhappy, he goes out of business. But our problem is, take when the financial crisis hit. Was the consumer protected, you know, with all this financial bubbles and all? No. Car companies. Two car companies there. One car company took care of the business, the other one failed. So I will use this as a point, even though you might not say exactly what happened. So the one that failed gets the bailout, and the person who succeeded get taxed. Exactly opposite. I mean, when they failed, they overdid it. They made a mistake. The consumer said, we are not buying enough of your products. So you don't tax successful people to bail out the unsuccessful people. So we have been doing exactly the opposite.
Tuesday night at 7:30, William Flax will be continuing the discussion of liberty in West Lecture Hall here on the campus. Thank you. Have a good night.